everyone, and welcome to our conference on creating transformative systems. My name is Mo Short, and I will be moderating our panel on transformative HR, envisioning new ways of building safe and affirming workspaces. I am the Human Resources Specialist for NJ CASA. I am a light brown-skinned Latina woman with short brown hair, wearing pink and black glasses, a black shirt, and a cream-colored sweater, sitting in front of a plain white wall. Our panelists today are Robin Parker, Yujin Kang, and Q. Olivia Rivers. Robin Parker is the Executive Director of the Beyond Diversity Resource Center. His work focuses on building a more inclusive society through anti-oppression training and organizational development. He is the co-author of the Anti-Racist Cookbook, a guide for conversations about race. Prior to joining the center, Parker was Deputy Attorney General in the New Jersey Division of Criminal Justice and Chief of the Office of Bias, Crime, and Community Relations. Robin?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to quickly describe myself. I'm an African-American man wearing a black shirt, and my background virtual is mostly white and yellow. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Robin. Our next panelist is Yujin Kang. Yujin is a trainer, organizational consultant, executive coach, and healing justice practitioner with over 10 years of experience, combining anti-racist equity principles, public health, and trauma-informed care into her facilitation, consulting, and program design. She combines her experience as a healing practitioner, first-generation immigrant, and survivor, weaving mind-body modalities and anti-racist practices into her work. Yujin?
Thank you, Mo. Hi, everyone. So great to be here. A description for me, I'm Yujin. I am a light-skinned East Asian woman. I'm wearing a cream jacket with a black top. Behind me, I have a virtual background that I wish was my real home that has a fireplace and some comfy pillows in the background. So great to be here.
Thanks, Yujin. Our final panelist is Q. Olivia Rivers. Q. Olivia Rivers serves as the CEO at the Bridge Over Troubled Waters, an agency whose mission is to prevent and end gender-based violence. She volunteers her time with young professional organizations and serves on various boards throughout the country. In 2023, she founded Q. Olivia Consulting and Mosaic Mentoring, which supports organizational management, leadership development, BIPOC mentorship, corporate wellness, and nonprofit culture transformation through collective healing-centered lens. Olivia?
Hello, friends. It's so amazing to share this space with you all. My name is Q Olivia. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the CEO of the Bridge Over Troubled Waters. I am a dark-skinned Black Afro-Latina, early 30s, with black curly hair, brown eyes, and I am wearing a black blouse. And sitting in my office in my background, there are lamps, fairy lights, and a lot of teal decor.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you all of our panelists for joining us today. We look forward to a very informative discussion. We'll have a series of questions, the first of which is directed to all of you. We know that workplaces are an environment in which, unfortunately, sexual harassment occurs. According to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and the National Women's Law Center, data shows that 38% of all women and 14% of men have reported experiencing sexual harassment at work, with Black women disproportionately represented among women who filed sexual harassment charges. We also know that sexual harassment is common but rarely reported, with an estimated 87 to 94% of individuals who experience workplace sexual harassment never filing a formal legal complaint. This question is in two parts. In what ways can HR practices be more innovative in preventing and responding to workplace sexual harassment? And why is it important to use an anti-racist lens when working to prevent and respond to workplace sexual harassment? I'll open the floor to Robin first, and then Olivia and Yujin, jump in when you're ready.
Thanks, Mo. I think that answer to the question is a complex one, but I also believe that, believe it or not, business offers some important ways of looking at it. And by that, I mean not traditional business, but some of the innovative business practices. Just with a little context. One of the things that we learn from business innovation is that it is important to begin to look at problems from a complexity leadership theory point of view. And that is that we look at problems as either ones that we have the tools to fix because we know how to fix them, or we see them, those are technical problems, or we see them as adaptive, ones that are complex, that involve whole systems, that involve whole people. Problem of sexual assault, of course, is a complex problem. And I think what that means, therefore, is that we can't use the traditional solutions that have been used in HR training to solve the problem. But instead, and we can certainly get into this more, we need to find solutions that take a really direct look at the real nature of the problems. What are those problems? How do we fall short in the trainings that we do give? What are the issues of obliviousness that we have in society around those problems? Um, I think we can get into more detail perhaps a little bit later, but I would say just as a general approach, we need to begin to abandon the traditional idea that the workplace is a place where, well, basically we're trying to prevent discrimination, and that sexual assault is just one of the small things that we need to approach. I would instead say that sexual assault has such a devastating impact, not only on the country at large, but also taking out billions of dollars in health costs for the workplace, that it is something that needs to be taken up in earnest and innovatively.
That was a great answer. I definitely agree with you, Robin. It is a complex issue for sure. And as I was processing this question and looking at what our agency has recently had to do as far as addressing it, there were some things that came to mind. The first one being really reviewing your policies and your culture. For me, coming in as a new CEO in the last 3 years, I noticed that some of our policies were very archaic. And what I've learned is that archaic policies are the thief of progress and growth. And so as leaders, we need to really review these policies on a regular basis and making sure that they foster a culture of respect and equality. And then as a leader, I have to make sure that me and my senior team, we model the policies and culture so that it permeates the entire workplace. We do a lot of training on bystander intervention, not just in our community, but within our culture as well, and making sure that our employees have resources to support one another. Another thing we're looking at over the next few, weeks or months is an anonymous reporting system. And I know that can be difficult with some agencies, but what we've learned by having a couple of reports internally is that we want to make sure that there's a true level of confidential reporting mechanisms to encourage employees and witnesses to come forward without fear of retaliation. And I know that's something we can probably jump into a lot more later. And then also, I feel one of the areas is to increase diversity. What I've learned is that harassment is more likely to occur in workplaces that lack diversity. Sometimes violence can be perpetuated if everything is homogenous. And as far as the two-part question of addressing it with an anti-racist lens, that's heavy as well, because I think you do have to look at sexual harassment being an intersection of gender, race, identity, and all these other social categories. That definitely influences how people experience harassment and how they're going to choose to report it. Currently, I know we're all in different states, but laws, especially here in Texas, they do exist to protect against sexual harassment or racial discrimination, but sometimes not both. So if you are someone like me who finds themselves in the intersection as a Black woman, sometimes that you can experience something called racialized sexual harassment. And then there's, where do the laws protect you when you kind of fall in that crossfire? So again, I think it takes a lot, as Robin said, addressing the power dynamics that contribute to systemic racism and all the biases. And so it's really hard, but it's really about building trust and making sure you're following all of your legal compliances.
Thank you both. I'm nodding a lot. I'm saying mm-hmm silently to myself in my office. Completely resonate with both of you. And something that I was thinking about too when seeing statistics, especially having worked in national and local violence prevention, is we know that statistics are so limited in terms of who is captured, the experiences of the people who answer, right, and are represented in data. So back to your point, Q Olivia is thinking about who isn't represented in our data and the folks that we're not hearing from and the stories that we're not seeing being centered. So one is for me, is thinking about probably how much higher statistics likely are if people are educated and understand what sexual harassment and sexual violence can look like in the workplace. I think one thing tangibly that folks can do in the workplace is start to debunk and make it very clear what the spectrum of behaviors are. I think for folks who've been in the workspace for a long time, right, there's those really traditional like videos or courses that you're forced to do. People might like click through and be like, yeah, I would never do that. They seem like really extreme examples. And of course that happens. That's where those examples come from. And I think it's important to show the subtleties of language, the ways people can comment on your race, on your gender, on disability in connection with harm. And I think those are the moments where people, including myself, I've been in spaces where I was like, that felt weird. That felt a little off, but it wasn't so extreme like the examples I'm always being presented about violence, to the point that I would think, oh, that's something I can do to report. I also think there can be a scary element of reporting. It can feel connected to, right, like policing and very like legal energy. And I think that's important to present as options for survivors and to also debunk what it takes and to have advocacy for people who want to report. A lot of the time, the burden is on the survivor to provide a lot of proof. And depending on the organizational culture, that can also be re-traumatizing. So as HR professionals and folks in workplace leadership, thinking about how can I lift the burden so that this is something that is being collectively looked at so we can have community care, and also what are some ways I can tangibly make sure that the person being harmed isn't the one that has double the labor to get support. And then lastly, in connection with the second part of the question with anti-racism, I think it's critical to think about the intersections that Olivia and Robin were talking about as it relates to identity. It's so limiting to talk about violence without talking about the different intersections of identity. I show up in the workplace as a full human being, and there are ways that I can't disconnect from my identities as I'm experiencing positive and negative interaction. So I think connected to violence prevention is this larger need for folks to be educated around not only diversity, but really equity and inclusion. How are folks who are looking different from me, have different access to privilege, receiving support or not in our workspace?
Thank you, everyone, for your amazing responses. I mean, that doesn't really, it's an understatement, but it's the first word that came to mind after each and every one of you spoke so eloquently about this. And it just makes me excited for our further discussion. The next question I have is for Robin. We know that typical workplace anti-sexual violence practices, at best, merely comply with anti-discrimination laws and do little to create a culture of mutual respect that addresses sexism, racism, and patriarchy as societal challenges. How can workplace HR programs effectively take responsibility for confronting sexual violence, not only as a workplace matter, but also as a societal malady?
Mo, thank you for that question. I mentioned before how differentiating between complex challenges, adaptive challenges, and technical challenges was really important. And I think one of the things that the workplace needs to do, therefore, is as we look at the problem of sexual assault, take a really hard look at how the society is responsible collectively for making sexual assault happen. And I don't say that lightly. What I mean by that is there is a history in our society, hundreds of years old, perhaps thousands of years old, of sexual assault being a continual problem along with sexism and patriarchy. And it is out of that that sexual assault in the workplace becomes a problem. On the one hand, that seems obvious, but on the other hand, it is not something that as a culture we talk about very much. Instead, sexual assault, sexual violence is seen primarily as being done by bad actors, perpetrators, and nobody else takes responsibility for that, mostly. And so what we end up with is HR practices that are really quite naive, right? Oh, let's talk about the law against discrimination. We have a poster up here. It says that, these are the things that you can do if it comes up, but we don't get at the heart of what is really happening. And so what I think needs to happen with HR practices is that we need to step away from the notion that sexual assault is mostly a private matter. It's a huge societal matter that we need to tackle. I also think that the workplace needs to take more responsibility for how it foments sexual assault. Remember that sexual assault happens in many kinds of workplaces, not simply in the office, but women, for example, who are migrants suffer high levels of sexual assault when they are working in agriculture. Many women and others who work in private companies experience high level of sexual assault because there is not much recourse. And so workplaces have to take a strong stance, not simply that the laws against discrimination should be well applied, but a synergy that we need to do something to eliminate sexism and all of the pieces of patriarchy that have helped sexual assault move forward. And so what I would say is if we really want to make a difference, one, we need to talk about the problem of sexual assault, not as something that is simply caused by a few bad actors, but something that we are all responsible for and want to change. Two, we need to recognize that the amount of dollars, and this is where the workplace synergy comes in, that's taken out of our economy because of sexual assault is huge, and therefore there's a really strong business reason to address this. And three, going back to your question on why it's important to take an anti-racist stance, instead of isolating the problem as one that is a problem for bad actors, an anti-racism stance or an anti-oppression stance gives us the opportunity to take a big step back and say, how is it that all of these actors at work, at home, and at school conspire to keep this problem going? My thought is that if we apply those principles, we can come up with practices, some of which our fellow panelists have talked about, that can be really innovative, that start to strike at the heart of the problem, and can also be liberating because they get at the underlying problem, which is sexism. So imagine conquering sexual assault, but also making the world better because we have ended sexism and other forms of oppression. Sounds like a big win-win.
Olivia, Eugen, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share?
Absolutely. I mean, Robin, you said it so eloquently, and just to build upon what he shared, just overall, I think we all know this, but our HR practices have to be proactive instead of reactive. That's what I learned coming into this role, is that, you can make statements about harassment or violence after something has happened, and while it might be a little helpful, it also seems performative at best. So having those conversations and making statements of equity and safety before they happen sets a tone for all on where the agency stands. This also might make an employee think twice before engaging in harmful behavior when they know the leadership has taken these stands and they're constantly bringing it up. And it will give victims the confidence to come forward to report. As my panelist Eugene said earlier, there is that fear of all of those things. And so when the culture is permeated, like this is where the agency stands, we're not going to wait till harm happens. We're going to continuously bring it up. It kind of helps alleviate any of those things that we were addressing earlier. And then also, I love that she brought up data, Eugene did, because it is tricky. The data that we see on an international or national level doesn't really capture it. So I think what we should do as leaders in our agencies is create our own data, follow our own data, identify the trends or patterns from our own complaints of workplace violence and harassment, so we know where to target intervention and prevention, and trying to make those efforts to update policies as necessary. And then also feedback. When I first came into this role, I told my director team, I said, let's do an employee survey. And that sometimes that scares leaders, getting employee feedback that could be raw. But really asking employees what they need. What does it look like? Including them in the strategic initiatives to address workplace harassment. And again, that goes back to just fostering a culture of zero tolerance at every level within the organization. So I couldn't have said it better than Robin, but I definitely think we just have to be more proactive across the board.
Thank you. One last thing I would add to my colleagues' amazing points is another way of approaching sexual harassment and sexual violence and just violence at large in the workplace is treating it as a public health issue and thinking about the ways also, for example, in what we've been discussing, racism, racial harassment, all of these things being connected to people's actual health, right? This is not something that's just interpersonal. It also affects the health on a macro level of the organization. Robin, you talked about business case. I think that's important to couple with, of course, the emotional impact and information of what it means for us to spend most of our time at work, right? The 9 to 5, I'm seeing my colleagues more than I'm seeing, unfortunately, my mom. So there are ways that we are trying to build a community and be intentional. And many organizations have a set of values and a mission statement. Connect that directly to how you can create a culture of health in your organization by preventing violence, by being proactive. And I think that could be an additional approach.
Thank you all so much. Eugene, our next question is for you specifically. What are some of the barriers you encountered with implementing innovative practices that challenge current customary policies, which embody oppressive and hierarchical practices? And how did you overcome them?
Yes, this has been a really interesting theme across my career, is being interdisciplinary. So through my education, I'm trained as a linguist, as someone who studied violence, currently in graduate school, studying how racism impacts our health. And so all of these ways, my brain is primed to connecting, oh, wow, how could we do this differently? How could we do this in a way that centers people and our hearts more? And a lot of times our workplaces are not set up for that. One, because it can feel risky, it can feel scary to bring in the personal experiences of folks, especially when it comes to experiences of violence or discrimination. How can we hold a container that lets people be honest and receive help, but also the HR lens, the kind of organizational lens of we also want to be mindful of liability, be mindful of our organizational reputation, of retention. So I would say some of the challenges I've experienced, I mean, one of the things for me has been really experiencing the impact of community spaces such as employee resource groups or affinity groups. That can be a really powerful way for people to come together who usually may not in an organic way, right? I might not work with you, Mo, but through this group, we're able to connect and share about our experiences. And one of the first things I hear when an organization is trying to bring a space like this is fear. Oh, what's going to happen when non-senior staff come together? What's going to happen when people of color come together? What's going to happen when women come together? And it makes total sense from kind of like a survival lens. If you've never had a specific space like that before, it can bring fear. It can bring also, I think, feelings of, well, what about me? Like being left out. So I think one of the ways I've overcome some of these challenges has been one, explaining explicitly what employee resource groups are and are not. For example, it's not a therapy group. It can be therapeutic and we can experience really real beautiful community, and there are limits to the space that are protected for everyone. Two, it's connected to building organizational culture, employee retention, and also receiving feedback in more organic ways that can happen outside of just employee surveys, which is what I think, which is an amazing first step, I think. Third, I think it's important to name the root of why employee resource groups exist, is because a lot of times people are not working in organizations that look like them and sound like them. That's why we have an employee resource group, for people to come together and share across different experiences, particularly folks who are living with multiple marginalized identities. That's why we're having this space, because I am not being broadly represented. The organizational policies are not built with me in mind. And that's something we can work to transform. But how can we do that if we don't hear from people? So I think connecting that to the equity piece, having very specific guidelines around this is what an affinity space is, this is what it's not. And then I think most importantly, having channels for folks to be looped in. So if, for example, there's an affinity group for parents, and there's this issue that arises where it's like, wow, a lot of parents are experiencing this type of discrimination, that would be important for senior leadership to know and to have pathways to create organizational change, so that spaces like this are not just treated like social clubs, right? It's not just community building, which I think is powerful in itself in a workspace, but it's also important that they're given organizational power through that partnership.
Thank you, Eugen. Robin, Olivia, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share or experiences that you'd like to talk about?
Sure. I really appreciate what Eugen said. And the only thing that I would offer in addition is that it is difficult to push against traditional ways of dealing with this problem in the work setting. Because, well, in work settings, often the priority is, well, what is our larger mission? How is it that we can be profitable? And how do we stay out of litigation, right? That's often what HR does traditionally. Right? But I think that one of the ways to overcome that resistance is to ask leadership within an organization to be really clear about what their values are, right? And if you ask leaders what their values are, they would generally say that, we want people to be treated well. We want our employees to be happy. We want our employees to be unfettered, so that they can do the best kind of work possible. And if they're really innovative leaders, they will say that we want all of our workers to thrive. Well, if that's the case, it goes without saying almost that sexual violence in the workplace and in the society at large has to be something that should be addressed, and that companies have to vocalize that value over and over and over again. Not, as Q Olivia said, just when there's a problem, but when you walk through the door, right? As part of regular meetings, as part of a culture where we talk about these problems because we're concerned about them, so that it's just not an afterthought, just not a sign-off that happens once a year on policy, but is really very much steeped in who people are at work. And to that extent, I think workplaces can have a big impact.
Incredible. You guys I'm so excited to be in this space with you all. I'm just nodding and all of that. So you guys pretty much covered it. I think just from a personal perspective, for me, coming in and taking over an agency that had been around for 45 years and only led by white people, there was definitely some resistance to change. And so what I learned as a new CEO, I'd read this book on like what to do in your first 90 days as an executive, and all that went out the door, right? Because what I learned is that even when you're trying to make positive change, resistance is natural and it's inevitable. And I think you have to be prepared for it. Any change that challenges norms and power structures is going to be met with resistance. And I think I knew that, but I didn't know that until I tried to make change. And for me, one of the things I wanted to do off the bat was been doing all the research on Sweden and all these other countries that implement, 36-hour, 32-hour work weeks. So in my mind, I'm going to present this. Everyone's going to love it. Everyone's going to be like, she's so cool. She's such a great CEO. And everyone's like, wait, hold on. You want us to work less time and get back some of our life? And I'm like, yes. And they're like, no. And I'm like, this has to be like, how are you not on board? But again, sometimes part of being a leader is being vulnerable and doing some self-reflection. What you have to do when you're presenting changes is you first have to highlight the issues and the concerns, which I didn't do. I think I thought everyone knew what the issues were, being overworked, burnout, all of that. But sometimes you really have to communicate it and say, I see these issues. I know you guys feel it. And then you have to communicate the need for effective change. What does change look like? Getting that buy-in. If we change to 36-hour or 32-hour work weeks, what does that mean for you? How can I help you navigate that? How do I help you problem solve and, do time management and all of those things? And so then you offering like training and town halls so people can ask questions of the leadership when changes are being made is really critical. So I will say that that's just something to expect. Even if you're trying to make good changes, there's going to be that resistance to change. And another thing I've learned is that resource constraints, right? Being a nonprofit is really difficult. Some initiatives and innovative practices that you want to implement are going to require financial investment. And as a nonprofit or an organization with restricted budgets, that may be a challenge, but you have to really prioritize that and say, where can we find the funding to support these changes that we're trying to implement? But change, there's always going to be resistance, even when it's good.
I'm just giddy over all of your responses. This is just really inspiring as well. And the acknowledgement that, like, yes, change is hard, change is scary, but change is necessary. And just hearing how each of you persevered through that, I don't know, that inspires me. So thank you. Thank you for sharing. Olivia, this next question is for you. Most workspaces conform to traditional hierarchical models that reinforce power imbalances and perpetuate harmful punitive practices. What are some shifts we can take to decolonize approaches to leadership and organizational culture? Also, how do we create more holistic, thriving models rather than just updating policies and hosting trainings, which, although helpful, are often undergirded by the same systems and frameworks we're seeking to dismantle?
I'm sure my colleagues will agree that we could spend 2 hours just on this question alone. So I'm very excited to answer it, and I'm excited to hear from them as well. But man, this is a beautiful question, very important, but I know hopefully we can, do it some justice. I will start by saying I'd like to recommend Edgar Villanueva's. He has a phenomenal book titled Decolonizing Wealth. And in this book and his research, he uses the term colonizer virus. And that's basically describes the negative impact on people and institutions that was a result of colonization. And although the physical conquest of colonization is over, I think, many of the ideologies remain, and they've been passed down for generations. And for those who are unfamiliar, the colonizer theme is divide, control, and exploit. That is the theme behind colonization. And if we're all honest with ourselves and we place our agencies or our workplaces under a microscope, you will find elements of one or all of those three themes, whether it's unintentional or not. So we do have to address it. And one thing that he says in his book, there are 7 methods for healing colonization. That's grief, apologize, listen, relate, represent, invest, and repair. Now, that is a long list, and it takes so much patience, a lot of practice, and a lot of intentionality to incorporate those 7 methods for healing. However, I really encourage people to look into that and start there. Because it's hard to answer this question because every organization is different, every person is different. So I can't give a glossed over answer. But I am something that may be a little bit more relatable if you have not read that book is there's one of my favorite movies is Remember the Titans. And there's a quote in that movie where the 2 leaders from the once segregated football teams have a conversation addressing the lack of leadership and excellence from both sides. And Gary and Julius, they're starting to exchange frustrations with having to do extra practices. And they start going back and forth about what they don't like about, what you're not doing, what I'm not doing. And Julius basically says, the Black football player says, I refuse to wear myself out for a team when we're not being treated equally. And then his counterpart, Gary, says, well, that's a poor attitude to have. And Julius says, my favorite line, he says, attitude reflects leadership, Captain. And so leaders have to model the behavior that they want to see in their culture. And there's this, I'm a millennial, and ever since I've come up, it's all about, and I'm sure before that, every generation feels this, that hustle and grind culture that permeates our society and workplaces. It's so harmful. I know I've seen an uptick in employee burnout, social isolation, mental health effects, chronic diseases in our employees, all of that, lack of productivity. And I think it's from that hustle and grind. There's this amazing woman named Trisha Hershey. She is the founder of the NAP ministry. And their philosophy is rest is resistance. And it's the idea that rest is a tool for liberation and healing and decolonizing. I definitely encourage people to go check her out, social media, all of that. And for me, when I think about rest as a Black woman in America, what that really means, it's awful. So her group addresses the suffering of generational exhaustion, the impact of racial trauma that we hold in our body, in our mind, and how do we really unravel white supremacy and capitalism that are so intrinsically etched into the roots of this country and the workplace. And so to make that shift, it takes a lot of work, right? It's not something you can do overnight, but I definitely, what I've tried to start doing and what I help train other nonprofits to do is, cultural awareness is a start. That's just the start. But I have been so surprised how many organizations do not incorporate cultural awareness and empathy and emotional intelligence into their daily practices. So I would start there. Also looking at decentralizing power structures, that urgency culture, even for me growing up, like in the world of the nonprofit, like everyone, all hands on deck all the time, you come in early, you stay late, you do all of this really hard work, but really looking at what is urgent and what is not. In my leadership trainings, I think we've used the Eisenhower method, the Eisenhower matrix, which shows what is really urgent versus what is important. So learning to prioritize things so you can kind of decrease that urgency culture in your nonprofit. And, really it's about mindset, right? We have to be vulnerable and open-minded to a system-wide change. It's not something we can just do in one area. And I think also refusing to reward colonizing behaviors, right? And making, glorifying busyness. I've coming up in this work, it's like, oh, Olivia stayed late helping a survivor last night, like kudos to her. And so when you hear that being praised, other people think, oh, I have to work late, work harder, do all of this to succeed or move up, when in reality, it's causing so much turnover and retention rates are plummeting. And so I'd like to say gentle managing, right? With my staff, I try to, again, model behavior. Attitude reflects leadership. When I see people working late, instead of being like, thank you so much for working late, you're a rock star, I say, hey, I noticed you were here late last night. What can I do to support you in making sure you leave at a decent hour? What does that workload shift look like? So they know that, yes, while I appreciate that, I don't want that to become your norm. And so again, it's a very loaded question. We could sit here talking all day, but I definitely want to hear from my fellow panelists.
Thank you. So much to add on to there, Olivia. Brilliant. Something that came to mind for me while I was listening to you share was one was also like look towards organizations who are experimenting and towards organizations who are taking those risks. And I think it's important to learn about folks doing the work, maybe even outside of your own industry. So knowing that there are folks who are implementing non-punitive practices such as restorative justice or transformative justice practices in circles, implementing co-director kind of more flat leadership models, folks who are doing 360 feedback. So it's not just a supervisor giving, feedback to the supervisee, people who are integrating things like emotional relationship building and commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of your performance evaluation. These are all ways that we can start to experiment and build and learn from people who are doing that work. And that really depends on your industry, what makes sense to start with. But I think start by starting and start small and build up. is part of the capacity building as well as getting buy-in. The other thing too, I really encourage people to do is get help. You do not have to be the expert of everything sexual violence, everything anti-racism. There are brilliant people who are excellent at that, who you can get help from. So whether that is a consultant, whether that is, for example, I just want to plug Workplaces Respond from Futures Without Violence. That's one of my former workspaces. It's a free national resource center that's connected to providing technical assistance to organizations who are interested in creating workspaces that are more trauma-informed and have survivors at the center. So a lot of this is also education on how we can get the people who do the work really well to come and help us and help translate some of that work. I think of like the translation piece and the code switching piece. Some things I might say in a nonprofit setting and it makes total sense. And other things I'll go to corporate and it'll be the same. The heart of the matter is the same. The words are different. And that's important to do in building buy-in and connecting with where people are at.
I just want to add briefly to what my co-panelists have said, and I really appreciate the comments, is that one of the things that I think that workplaces need to get over, if you will, and indeed society needs to get over, is the failure to discuss the gendered nature of sexual violence. I mean, it's obvious, the sexual violence tends to skew heavily toward people who identify as women as being the targets, right? But in the workplace, there's well, no, we don't want to talk about that because, that's really kind of icky. And, what would it mean if we started to say that men are the problem? Can we really do that and keep the workplace safe? And it's really uncomfortable. All of those wonderful things that keep the problem of sexual assault in place and sexual violence in place. I remember when I years ago worked in the New Jersey Division of Criminal Justice. This is an example of how society conspires to help sexual violence go forward. There's a paper called the Trentonian. It's one of and it used to have something called the Page 6 girl. It was usually a woman wearing a bathing suit, that kind of thing. And I remember a manager there would every week hang up the Page 6 girl. And this was a manager, very high level, and he thought it was funny, right? Very few people said anything about that, right? It was just, well, it's fine. We really don't want to address the nature of that. He's a little bit of an oddball. Everybody had their excuses, right? And I bring that up to say that that's something that is highly gendered. It's not simply a matter of a bad actor. It is a matter of a number of bad actors, I would say, including the people that did the Page 6 girl at the paper, the people who worked there, who were male, who didn't intervene, and a great deal of institutional silence that allowed that to go on for months. We need to find ways to break away from that. And I believe that taking that anti-racist stand that people have been talking about is really important, because we can say, look, this can't stand anymore, because this is something that we can critique and we must talk about. And I would also say that although it is important to get the leadership of women in this, that men need to step up. They need to not be silent, and they need to make sure that they communicate that they believe the problem of sexual assault is their problem too.
Thank you all so much for such insightful responses to a really complex set of questions. One final question for everyone, and this goes out to each of you. Within our current capitalistic system, the prioritization of profit and productivity has created a quote unquote urgency culture that often results in overworked staff and burnout. How do we resist this harmful workplace culture and foster more supportive, anti-oppressive workplaces while balancing the urgency of the work? And how is this connected to creating safer, more affirming workplaces for all survivors? I'll open this up to anyone who wants to start.
A few things come to mind for me in hearing this question. One is how trauma responses show up in the workplace for both trauma survivors and just all of us having survival responses. And one of the first things that comes to mind when I think urgency culture, in addition to how that ties in with white dominant culture in America, is the fight or flight. A lot of times when we rush people to make a decision or to say something or to do something, it can replicate power dynamic that's already represented in someone whose power is taken away when they're surviving violence. And in the workplace, I think it's important to tie these things as we think about being anti-racist, as we think about systemic oppression, tying how does urgency culture, and this is not to be confused with when things are a crisis and we need to move quickly. I used to work as a domestic violence service provider. So there were really times I did have to be quick, and that was appropriate for my job and that was appropriate for the moment. And how can we balance, not misunderstanding the words that I'm saying, is that there's a difference between what is important in an emergency and a true crisis and what is an organizational culture of rushing people. And as a result, stifling creativity and innovation, which comes from experimenting, taking our time, breathing, pausing. And we have research on this too. And this is where I really lean on, like, bring in research, bring in folks who talk about this. Sometimes we need an outside perspective to come into our organization and for our leaders to hear from someone who really does this work well. So bringing in folks to help build that capacity and buy-in. And then secondly, connecting how burnout is also bad for business. I think sometimes leadership responds to the both and of having the business case of lost productivity, retention, how much money and time it takes. Also how devastating it is when we lose such amazing people. We have the burnout cycle. There are little research 12 stages of burnout. We know the signs. This is also a public health issue. So thinking about it from that lens through prevention, like Olivia said, is thinking in a preventative way so that we can also be an organization that retains our people. And then finally, thinking about how this connects to creating safer, more affirming workspaces. A lot of times I think we talk about creating community and workplaces as if it's something in the distant future, like futurism. And I think there are ways we can really be, it's important to be that way and think about, wow, there are some things that we can't do now that we can do later. And it's important to think about tangible things where we can practice liberation today, like right now in our interactions, in the way I do supervision, in the way that I handle sensitive information you share with me. So I would encourage people to also think about the ways we can practice that today. There are things we could do right now to practice healthier and safer workspaces. And then there are more structural things that we can do to do justice by our team.
Thank you, Eugen. I think your comments are so well taken. I would just add that one of the things that I think can be helpful as we begin to talk to people in the workplace and other places is to remember history and how it is history informs how we frame problems like burnout. We have a long, centuries-old history, for example, of stating that, well, the problem of sexual assault is really a woman's problem. And by that, I mean, if there are claims, then women have to prove that they resisted, for example, that men are largely protected from claims against sexual assault because in the past, women were seen as property. The discussion about sexual assault is not something that we want as part of mainstream public discourse. All of those streams of thought, all of those things that were part of history, all of those things that affected women who were royalty or who were just part of everyday people inform how we think about women and the problem of sexual violence today. So, when we think about things like, well, we have a culture today where we need to, really move on to things that are quote unquote important because we're rushed and it is not productive. That historically is not very much different from a culture that said, look, we don't have time to hear about the sexual assaults of complaints of women. If they can't prove that they resisted, it's their problem. I think the hard lesson here is that so much of what we see as barriers to progress really stem from a deep-seated, innate cultural practice that seeks to constantly push women to the side and allow sexual assault to thrive because that is our neutral, right? That's the way that we have played it out for so long that we cannot see other ways of doing it. The way through that, I believe, is to do just what we've been doing today. Talk about it, critique it, and say, these are some of the new practices and these are some of the new ways that we need to view the problem so we can get really innovative solutions.
Once again, marvelous answers by my fellow panelists. This is also a hard question, really, to just put in a bite-sized response. But going back to it, how do we resist this harmful workplace? I want to just say no, but I know it's more complicated than that. But for me, as an incoming leader, for me, it has really been prioritization. Research shows us that we are not good at humans at prioritizing the most important things. We want to prioritize the shortest deadlines, the things we can do quickly. And so I think as a leader, you really have to make this conversation, as Robin just said, a priority. Make it a priority. Keep it at the forefront of everyone's mind so that it is intrinsically involved in all of the policies and procedures. And it becomes a norm, a cultural norm. And then as I've been working on my agency strategic planning, realizing that a lot of people don't know how to set goals, right? And so many people don't set realistic goals for what their agency can do, what they're able to manage on a regular basis, because we do have that battle of fighting against what grantors need or what numbers look like and outcomes and all of that. But when you set tangible goals, it allows you to get you and your staff off of the urgency hamster wheel, so to speak. Also, I would say holistic well-being is so important. One thing that we've started doing is incorporating wellness into our benefits packages outside of the normal benefits, right? And so you have to realize that you almost have to create a buffet style. You know, you can't offer yoga to everyone or gym passes. Not everyone's going to need that or want that. You really have to curate and tailor what it is that you can offer. I am the queen of wellness days. I'm notorious for telling my staff, I want you to call in well, not sick. So we've incorporated wellness days that are not tied to the PTO they earn. They're just given. We have birthday holidays. I'm always like, give them a day off, give them a day off, right? And so again, incorporating those wellness and making it a part of your organizational norm. And so people aren't afraid to call in, or they're not waiting to use certain PTO when they're really sick. They can just say, hey, I'm spending time with my kids today, or I don't want to be at the office. It's too gorgeous outside, right? But you still have to balance that, right? And speaking of balance, I know that was actually in the question, how do you balance all of this? There was this really beautiful picture that was painted at a women's luncheon I went to recently where they talked about we are really trying to find the balance, all of us in our lives. But as we find that balance, we're always going to be juggling balls. And she said something real that stuck with me. She said, some balls are glass and some balls are rubber. The key is to never drop the glass balls. And so I feel like this is conversation when it comes to workplace. This is one of those glass balls that we cannot drop because it's just too important. There are things that we are not going to be able to focus on 100% of the time. So we have to be willing to lay down those rubber balls because they can bounce back anytime. But those glass balls, we definitely need to keep them in the rotation. And then another thing I would say is to schedule rest. Be intentional about scheduling breaks for yourself and your team, shutting down the office when you can. I know nonprofit, we never sleep, we never rest. We have 24-hour shelters, as do I, but scheduling breaks and sabbaticals and times for creativity and fun. You know, we have employee retreats, and 2 of those retreats are just to have fun. It's not to talk business. It's just to say, hey, we're going to a park and we're going to grill and we're going to get to know each other and connect. And then I would say for me as a leader, one thing I've had to learn is to be a buffer. We get a lot of external requests and expectations from our community, from our stakeholders. Be a buffer for your staff and model healthy boundaries, saying, hey, you want us to come do a presentation tomorrow? Sorry, we can't. We need at least, a 48-hour notice. And when your employees feel like they have safe and brave spaces to set those boundaries, they will in turn create that same dynamic for survivors. Because behind colonization is the idea of working in silos. That's what colonization was about. If you look at slavery, like keep the people separate. When they're separate, they don't talk. When they don't talk, they can't rebel. And then power and control are maintained, right? Doing this work is essential because you can't claim to be a safe space for survivors and addressing violence in your communities when your own employees are being oppressed in the workplace. So it will spill over, and survivors then will be the collateral damage.
Outstanding, each and every one of you. Thank you so much. Your gems of wisdom are gifts for us to take with us today. That concludes our panel. I want to thank Robin Parker, Q. Olivia Rivers, and Eugene Kang for their time today, for their wisdom. I want to thank all of the attendees to this panel. We thank you for your time and your commitment to this mission and your support. I hope you all have a great day.